Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Amanda Kramer, and I'm the Alumni Engagement Program Manager at the University of Colorado Boulder's Leeds School of Business. Welcome to our 9th webinar series. We have certainly faced some trying times over the past year and a half, and here at CU Boulder, we have gathered our world-renowned faculty and alumni to provide frank and timely insights to help you learn and navigate these times. Today is the first of 4 webinars in this webinar series. To view upcoming webinars, please visit our website at colorado.edu/business/alumni. Click the drop-down arrow and click Attend Online Webinars. For today's webinar, we're so excited to welcome Dr. Austin Okigbo, who is here presenting Music and the Culture of Epidemics, How We Missed Important Clues for Stemming the Social Fallouts of COVID-19. A few housekeeping items before we begin. First, if you have any questions now or during the presentation that you would like to ask Austin, please send a question through the Q&A interface. We will monitor questions as they are submitted, and Austin will respond to them at the end of the presentation. As a reminder, for optimum audio quality, we do have everyone on mute except for myself and our speaker. If you experience any technical difficulties during the webinar, please notify us through the chat interface, and one of our support specialists will touch base. Lastly, a link to access the webinar recording will be sent to all registrants tomorrow, along with the survey link and supplemental resources from today's presentation. Now, I'm excited to introduce today's speaker. Austin Okigbo is an associate professor in the College of Music and affiliate faculty in ethnic studies and global health. He directs the CU World Vocal Ensemble, which has featured with the world-famous South African vocal group, the Ladysmith Black Mambazo, and the multi-award-winning popular musician and activist, Johnny Clegg. As a public scholar, Okigbo has featured in a number of local and international radio and television programs, including BBC, Channels TV Lagos, Nigeria, and Black Radio Consortium as contributor and analyst on the entertainment industry, cultural education, and policy. Welcome, Austin, and thank you so much for being here. I'm going to hand the webinar over to you now.
Thank you very much, Amanda, and welcome everybody to this session. It's my pleasure to be speaking on this very topic, which is quite dear to me, one that I've had as formed part of my research for quite a while. I've published extensively on topics related to global health, music and global health. Without wasting time, I would like to get on to a little bit of something that I'm sure all of us are attentive to. Maybe already sometimes we have become slightly desensitized with the statistics of, related to the number of infections, both within here in the United States and around the world, and the number of deaths that have occurred. If we, as at yesterday, this is the current where the global COVID-19 toll stands, showing about 174 million cases around the world with 3.74 million. As at this morning, actually, it has risen to 3.75 million. That of United States stands at 33.4, currently updated this morning to 33.5 million cases with over 590,000 deaths. And we're seeing a lot happening already, still happening, whereas it's beginning to look like the situation is improving dramatically here in the United States, although there are some regions, especially the southern United States, that are still dealing with challenges, including new rising cases. If you have been paying attention to the news this morning, a state like Alabama, some have seen already about 700% rise, including resistance to vaccine, which is already a pointer to the fact that the United States might actually not meet the 70% goal that the president has set for by the 4th of July. And while we are at that, Brazil, India, and a number of other countries are still battling with it. The continent of Africa seems to have done well so far, but the trend is beginning to look, go in the south, the upward direction, showing that the continent might actually be facing a wave if care is not taken. So all these things are kind of sources of concern and worry to everybody that is involved in the study in the issues related to global health and as far as this particular COVID-19 situation is concerned. But one related to this topic is maybe one question somebody might ask is there a possibility that we would not have reached this number of cases, 174 million cases with 3.75 million deaths around the world? That's a question that we might be able to answer if we are to especially engage with what I call the social fallouts, which is why this topic. So if you look at the collage of images I have here, it can be a pointer for us what I mean by the social fallouts of the COVID-19. To the upper left there, you see a lady carrying a placard that says, "My ethnicity is not a virus." That's here in the United States. Just right below it, you see people carrying guns and banners. You might think you might confuse it to maybe a picture originating on January 6th as what happened on Capitol Hill. But that's actually the Capitol at Lansing in Michigan at a time when during the first lockdown, we started seeing violent resistance in many places, including here in Denver, that we noticed that. And that of Michigan went way out of hand when we saw people carrying assault rifles invaded the Capitol building and even being urged by the person who is supposed to be leading the country, asking them to go and liberate the state. And then you see the one at the bottom there that says, "I will not be masked, tested, tracked, or poisoned. This will not be my new normal." That image there is actually from the UK, from Britain. Showing again, you can see the people there confronting a police officer in the UK, challenging everything related to the guidelines and rules for containing the spread of this virus. All again to this bottom right here, no to forced corona vaccinations, no to 5G, no to connection of humans. And all of this, and that one is actually coming out of France or Germany, as a matter of fact. So you see a lot of these things from around the world, and they are all pointing to so many things, including violent and sometimes near violent resistance to guidelines, lockdown, isolation, social distance, and all the rules that have been provided by scientists and public health workers to help us deal with the spread of the virus, as well as the conspiracy theories, whether this virus is originating from 5G. Some say it is invented in a laboratory. Some say it is Bill Gates. I'm sure recently, just yesterday, Reuters published a false news that said that Bill Gates is wanted, kind of rebutting it by the World Criminal Court. I don't know where that one is originating from for crimes against humanity. Anti-vaccination movement and conspiracies, even before we ever had a vaccination, before they ever hit the shelves, people were already bringing out all sorts of conspiracy theories. And all these issues, and now of course, anti-Asian sentiment, and we have seen the rise of anti-Asian sentiments and attacks on people of Asian descent across the United States. All of these are what I call the social fallouts. And it seems that as they were happening, the presidential task force, whether it is here in the United States, even in other developed countries and around the world, there were task force, there were scientists working, trying to do their best to contain this disease. But there was so much resistance, and evidence shows that all these aspects of social fallouts are part of compounding factors which made it worse. maybe we would have done better than we have done. But the good news at least is that there is, we seem to be things are trending in the right direction. Only we don't know how long it's going to last, especially with, the rising cases of the variants. So in summary, I say disease epidemics like the spread of the virus itself causes human minds to run wild, generating sets of reactions and social fallouts that complicate and often undermine medical science interventions and policy guidelines. The question then I ask as an ethnomusicologist is, can the arts, especially music, comprise the means of understanding the human mental processes that account for those social fallouts? This question is one that I'm trying to answer today, and I'm trying to unpack, and I'm going to have to deal with it using data from ethnographic studies, as well as historical analysis of the history of epidemics, in order for us to understand why I call it the culture of epidemics. And that's where I'm headed right now. Between March and April, when Colorado and several other states in the US first went into a lockdown, some artists from the United States and around the world began generating music, creating music, and these include countries like Nigeria, Uganda, South Africa. They began to produce COVID-themed songs. The first one that came to my notice then was Imake's rap remix that was using Cardi B's rant about the coronavirus, where Cardi B was shouting about coronavirus as something that is real. And then much later, Adam Sandler's quarantine song, which he performed with, in a show, in a late night show. And then Gloria Estefan's We Needed Time, in which she kind of tried to conscientize her audience to sit back and maybe look at the positive side of what is going on, especially as she tried to re-examine the capitalist, re-engage the capitalist atmosphere in the United States, where there's this fast-paced life, so much that we oftentimes miss out in being with one another, engaging with one another. And maybe now the coronavirus is slowing us down, and Gloria Estefan thinks perhaps we needed the time to rethink and to re-engage with one another. Going out beyond the shores of the United States, we have people like Bobby Wine from Uganda, who is a reggae artist and a politician. He sang his own song, Coronavirus Alert, in which he kind of tried to bring attention to the fact that this is real, especially in a country where information is sometimes suppressed and people are wondering if are rather consuming fake news and consuming conspiracy theory news. Another person is M. Josh, who uses Fela style Afrobeat music to engage with social issues in Nigeria. And he sang about it as Animal Kingdom, criticizing the failure of the Nigerian administrations and several administrations and politicians to upgrade the infrastructure and the healthcare facility in the country, and they prefer to go for treatment overseas. And once the lockdown happened, everybody was stuck with a poorly set up hospital system. And interestingly and unfortunately, some of the first people that succumbed to the disease were politicians, including the chief of staff to the president. Another person is Paco T. So all these musicians are producing songs related to the COVID-19. However, one of the things that come out of these song productions, in the case of Adam Sandler, for instance, he uses a comedic approach, taps into the folklorization of children and elderly's experience with treatment by doctors and nurses. But then also he addressed the issue of blame game and the Chinese origin of the coronavirus, warning that we should stay away from that blame game if we really want to contain the disease. As I watched the development, I returned to my research in South Africa that I began as a Fulbright Fellow in 2006 through 2007. Using archival and ethnographic methods, I sought to glean the historical uses of music in times of epidemics, stretching over a period of 300 years, beginning especially in 1713. Over this period, the territory known today as the Republic of South Africa experienced several documented epidemics, including the smallpox that began in 1713 to the late 19th into early 20th century, rinderpest epizootic that began between 1896 and 1903, syphilis between 1880 and the 1950s, malaria epidemic that happened in 1904, and then influenza, the one we know so much that sometimes people call Spanish influenza, between 1918 and into the 1920s. And then of course, the HIV/AIDS that first was recorded in South Africa in 1982 and has continued to be a public health problem in South Africa. By juxtaposing case studies on the smallpox influenza epidemics with my own fieldwork on music and HIV/AIDS, I explored the meanings that people make of their experiences of diseases. The songs were used to articulate issues such as the loss of traditional values, to provide commentary on faith and religion, and to express perspectives that touch on interracial relationships in the context of disease epidemics. Through a close reading of text and musical stylistics, I discovered that socio-cultural factors such as race, economics, and spirituality comprise important frameworks for constructing meanings around the issue of health and in the context of epidemics. However, I have broadened my research and my studies and my horizon by looking more broadly on the music in the global history of epidemics. In fact, this last spring, I taught both senior undergraduate and doctoral musical arts DMA seminars that are centered on music and global health. In these courses, they allowed me to further examine the global history of epidemics going back into Renaissance Europe. And I'm currently working with another colleague whose text formed part of my literature for my course, Remy Chu. He is currently at the Loyola University of Maryland on a project that is centered on this theme of music in the global history of epidemics. So what I want to do without wasting time, and we can always talk a lot more about some of these things, is to take two musical examples to launch us into the conversation. And the two song examples I'm going to play and analyze here. One is from my research on South Africa, the Influenza 1918 song composed by Ruben T. Galuza, and another one, O Santa Sebastiane, which is an isorhythmic motet by Guillaume Dufay that was written in the 15th century. So these will kind of help to show us what I call the culture of epidemics and how music has participated and played a role in articulating people's experiences and rendering those experiences into performance. The first quarter regarding this song, Influenza, the first quarter of the 20th century marked an era of great pestilence in South Africa, especially the influenza of 1918 to 1920. Part of the pandemic that killed between 20 and 40 million people worldwide, influenza entered Southern Africa via ships of infected soldiers that were returning from the First World War, who landed at the major ports of Durban and Cape Town. And from there, the disease spread rapidly around the urban centers and into the rural areas. We have only general records of the rate and impact of the epidemics in the Black South African population, thanks mainly to the government's indifference to the health status of those who lived in urban slums and the rural areas. What is more significant, however, is how Africans themselves responded to the epidemic, especially in the domains of spirituality and artistic expression. So the case of Reuben Tolaka Lekbaluza, acclaimed South Africa's foremost composer of his generation, presents a particularly illustrative example. Born into a musically inclined Christian family, Reuben attended and later taught at the Zulu Oklange Christian Institute, where his musical prowess was boosted under John Dube. Famous for his nationalistic compositions, Aluza's large collection of songs written in tonic cipher and published by the Lovedale Institution Press were used to instill a sense of direction in his Natal and South African urban Black audiences. And they often addressed the social, political, economic experiences of the people. Around 1919, with South Africa still under the scourge of the influenza, Aluza composed a song titled Influenza 1918, which the Lovedale Institution Press published as part of the Sulphur Leaflet series. The song was part of Aluza's 1930 recording project, which is double quartet at the HMV studio in London. With Aluza himself on the piano and as well as was on the piano as well as the director. The recording was remastered by Paul Vernon and Charlie Crump and released in a compact disc much later in 1995. Contained in a recording along with Influenza are other songs by Aluza and his arrangements of pre-existing folk songs, which present a vivid portrait of one of the most turbulent phases in Black South African history. These include Umthetho Weland Act, which is the recorded version of his Silusapo Land Act. I'll comment on this later, and Sanibona, which also marks partial reference to the influenza epidemic. The compositional style of Influenza shows clear Western influence, English hymn style 4-part harmony, verse chorus format, and the use of periodic chromaticism, especially in the refrain section. Influenza could be analyzed as musical binary from a form in A prime form. The musical sections do not necessarily correspond to the text as the textual placing overlaps with the musical sections. The text of the A section paints a picture of the impact of the epidemic in the African population, the message of which carries into line 16 through 19 in the A section, while Aluza's chronicling mirrors the documentation by other scholars regarding the global onslaught of the disease among people in their prime between ages 20 and 40. He differs from them in his observation that the epidemic also decimated the elderly population, thus differentiating the African community's experience from that of other global contexts. It is in the S section, however, that Aluza makes the most significant poetic statement. He employs the biblical hermeneutical strategy of typology analysis, in which the events of Israelite history were interpreted as prefiguring modern events. In Aluza's lyricism, the influenza epidemic is likened to the punishment in the biblical Exodus event, which God visited upon the Hebrews for abandoning his covenant with them. Hence, Aluza calls for repentance and change in behavior using the medium of his song. And here I would like to play just briefly this piece, and you can hear it momentarily. 1918, I can leave it there. You can read through the text yourself. Those are the translations. What you had was performed in Zulu language. But going further on my analysis of these songs, contemporary sources affirmed that Kaluza's interpretation reflects a common attitude about the disease, at least among Zulu and other Nguni Christians. The message in the song parallels that of Non-Teta Nkwenkwe, a closer prophetess and influential millenarian preacher who, during the outbreak, interpreted the epidemic as God's punishment for the growing immorality and mischief among Africans who thoughtlessly embraced Western and colonial lifestyles. Nkwenkwe warned that only penitence would prevent a total obliteration of the population of her people in the Ciskei and all over South Africa. It is not clear whether Kaluza himself intended this song to be interpreted or even performed as religious music or within a religious space. Nonetheless, the sermonic nature of the song, especially in the B section, and the overall English hymn-like nature of the song speaks to his Presbyterian upbringing. One might argue that the correlation between the hymn-like compositional style of the song and its sermonic lyricism is intentional, especially because anthems are known to be historically composed in the English church with a homiletic functional role. No Teta Nkwekwe's interpretation of the thoughtless embrace of Western and colonial lifestyles has also been paralleled in other published songs by Kaluza, such as Sanibona, We Greet You, or Intandane, a song about orphanage that were composed around 1920. These songs were addressed particularly to South Africa's urban population, who Kaluza believed had become disconnected from their rural roots, resulting in their loss of the sense of traditional values and uncritical embrace of frivolous Western lifestyles. The African value of commitment to family and community, as he saw it, was threatened most significantly during moments of great anguish, such as those unleashed by the influenza epidemic. On another level, disputes over land ownership and eminent domain may have also shaped how Africans responded to the influenza epidemic. The outbreak came barely 5 years after the 1913 Land Act, which led the blueprint for governmental appropriation of 70% of the territory for a small white population that made up less than 18% of the total population. Ruben Kaluza responded with a song titled Silusapo or Elan Act. Similar to their responses to the smallpox epidemic, South African Blacks distrusted the Europeans and the white government's sincerity as interveners in the epidemic. Traditional healers and itinerant preachers dissuaded people from participating in government-sponsored inoculations, warning that the influenza was a device of the Europeans to finish off the native races of South Africa. And as it had not been quite successful, they were sending out men with poison to complete the work of extermination. Ruben Kaluza's song, which calls on all Africans to unite in defense of their land, could have contributed to, or at least coordinated with Africans' understanding of land as an important factor in public discourses about the influenza epidemic. His songs thus reflect the ways in which Africans thought about the spiritual and material causes of disease, providing insight into the ways Africans responded on the ground. Let me get to the second piece very quickly so that we can have enough time for conversation here. This song, O Sante Sebastiane by Guillaume Dufay, is an isorhythmic motet. If any one of us were ever to do time traveling and come to a time in the 16th century, we will more likely hear this piece during one of the outbreaks of plague in Milan. I introduced this song as a piece that anyone would more likely have heard in Milan during the outbreak of famous plague that will come to be associated with then Cardinal Archbishop of Milan, Carlo Borromeo. Hence, it is also called, the plague was also called the Borromean plague. The plague is important because of the political history that parallels the political mishandling of COVID-19, as we have seen it today, both here in the United States and in many other places around the world. What is it about the Borromean plague? This origin is not certain. Some believed it originated in Hungary and came into Italy through a woman who sold spicy oil. By 1575, however, it had spread in neighboring Trentino, killing up to 40,000 inhabitants. Meanwhile, the Milanese nobles were busy playing. They held games and tournaments in the midsummer of 1576, to honor Don Juan, the visiting priest of Austria. It was even rumored that one of the priest's entourage carried the virus and spread it. Soon after the outbreak, the Marquis of Ayamonte and governor of the region, Londono, issued an edict forbidding any of the city officials from leaving the city, but to stay and help to maintain order. Meanwhile, his Austrian guest quickly ran away with his entourage, and the Marquis himself fled to his country home. Following his flight, other city officials ran away to their country homes, leaving the poor masses in the city. In the absence of any city officials to enforce the sanitary rules and to maintain order, the entire city turned chaotic, and the plague spread like wildfire. Hearing of the state of lawlessness and the impact of the plague, Archbishop Charles Borromeo, who was attending a meeting in Lodi, quickly rushed back and took over management of the city himself. In addition to rallying the people to cleaning up the city and restoring order, he also organized what I come to label as pestilential liturgy, which included the street processions, mass and devotional prayers to saints, especially Saint Sebastian, who had come to be known by that time as a patron saint in times of plagues. Interestingly, the city was liberated and declared free of the plague on January 20, 1578, which is the feast day of Saint Sebastian. And I'm going to play this piece very quickly, then we can continue. For the sake of time, I wouldn't have to play all of this. The interesting thing about this Borromean plague is that it took 14% of the city's 120 population at the time. This was a case of like Nero was playing while Rome was burning. Why do I have to choose this isorhythmic motet, and why would isorhythmic motet be an important piece of music to use in this pestilential liturgy? Isorhythmic motet is a style that is used for glorifying the state in public celebrations. It's functioned as part of it's functioned politically as a form of enhancing and bringing about social cohesion. Its use in the plague processions that was designed and introduced by Archbishop Charles Borromeo, therefore, helped to enact the body politics of the city community by restoring sense of order and togetherness that had been lost due to the failure of the city's political leadership. What I have done, we can talk a lot more about some of these songs and how they participated in the two epidemics and in the broader. What I have done so far, what I'm trying to show us here is to provide contextual analysis of song examples in order to show how the circumstances of given disease epidemics inform the compositional choices of the songwriters and the uses of such songs in the context of epidemics. The contextual analysis thus reveal how certain factors such as religion, kingship, politics, and economics remain constant in public health regardless of time and space differentials. Because these remain constant, I argue that they produce same or at least similar results in any given form of disease epidemic. Unfortunately, as I watched the presidential task forces that we are charged with dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic, both here in the United States and in many other places like Britain, France, Italy, Nigeria, South Africa, name it. I noticed that all were preoccupied with the medical aspects of the disease control, and none paid attention to the socio-cultural issues. Hence, the eruption of chaotic and violent protests, blame games, and conspiracy theories took state officials unawares. It is on this basis that many have described the situation as unprecedented. But it's not really unprecedented, at least looking at some of what I've already presented. I would say it is because they had no ethnomusicologists in their midst. Maybe that's why nobody paid attention, nobody noticed, and some of these things took them unawares. So theoretically, I argue that the arts bear and convey the complexities of the human mind. Hence, music as an expressive art form created in the context of epidemics is the most effective means of understanding people's imaginations about disease epidemics. It reveals their fears, their hopes, and their struggles, and how they deal with the social, economic, and political fallouts of disease epidemics. Now, if we were to go back to all the artists, both those who created songs in the context of the current COVID-19 or the influenza epidemic or others, all artists, both those who are creating music in the context of the current pandemic and those who created music in the past plagues, are addressing the issue of the epidemic from multiple perspectives, but at the same time reflecting as such the various moods of the people in the societies, thus capturing the social dimensions and ways of responding to the pandemic that is eluding epidemiologists, by virtue of which they complicate the scientific efforts at stemming the spread of the virus. Therefore, and in conclusion, I argue, human beings are social animals with mind too complicated to be easily understood in terms of their biological mode of being. Medical scientists are trained to understand the nature of diseases and how to treat them, but not necessarily always about the social, cultural, political, and religious parabolas that inform how they respond to these disease epidemics. We can therefore understand people better based on what proceeds from their minds, such as the arts and music, with which they articulate and bring forth that which exists in their imaginations, just like the Latin adage says, agere sequitur esse. Therefore, attentiveness to these would have helped policymakers, I suggest, to anticipate some of the challenges that we have witnessed in the current pandemic in order to develop strategies for preventing them and or even to mitigate their impact. In fact, if we had engaged with some of this history, we probably would have done better. I argue that we can learn this lesson today. It is my hope that future epidemics can be managed better if we can learn this lesson. And I will rest it there for question and answer time. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much for all of that information, Austin. As a reminder, if you have a question to ask Austin, please type that into the Q&A feature right now, and we will begin the Q&A session. So the first question here is from Karen. She asked, in your research, have you noticed any gender differences?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things I noticed while I was doing my research in South Africa, even looking at the case of both the smallpox that started in the 18th century, early 18th century, through even influenza and HIV/AIDS, there is always a gendered aspect of it. When one of the songs that I documented under smallpox was a women wailing song, where the song women were singing about, thinking about, the possibility that if they have a way, they would fly to heaven, fly off to heaven, where they will have fire and pot to cook and be at peace and at rest. Because what was going on at the time is a lot of women, if they contracted the disease, there was this tendency to even blame them and associate them as the vectors for the disease, which even call them witches. In fact, even that factor was seen in the HIV/AIDS situation in South Africa. The first person that whose death was literally a public execution that eventually led to a heightened form of, if you like, activism, was a woman called Gugu Dlamini, who spoke out on television, on Radio Ukhozi, Zulu radio, talked about, was open about her status as HIV positive, and people stoned her to death in a place called Kwamakuta because they called her a witch because she was HIV positive. So over time, one of the things you notice is how sometimes the blame game can either shift from where there is, racial or ethnic heterogeneity. One group who feels superior to the other will blame the others. Where there is racial or ethnic homogeneity, then it can sometimes devolve that into that of male versus female, or upper economic class or social class versus lower social class. I don't know if that has answered the question. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that information. Great. The next question comes from an anonymous attendee who said, most of your presentation seems to be focused on the lyrics and text of the music, suggesting potentially that literature and poetry can also achieve what you're talking about. Is there something special about music that makes it really important in this respect?
Well, yeah, it may have centered largely on that, but if you look at my analysis of the isorhythmic motet, there is a reason why I talked about isorhythmic motets. The reason why it's called isorhythmic is because it's a musical style that lends easily to procession. And that was why Charles Borromeo, in creating the pestilential liturgy, a large part of it was processional. Isorhythmic motets formed an important part of the repertoire that were used in those pestilential liturgies. So not necessarily lyrics, but lyrics is a large part of it, of course, because what lyrics does is that it allows you to probe and in order to understand what is actually going on. But again, my point was that I'm not limiting my research. I'm not saying that only music can explain some of these things. Remember, I talked about expressive forms, but I'm an ethnomusicologist, right? So I'm talking from my perspective and angle as an ethnomusicologist. So absolutely, there are other expressive forms that can also play a role.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. The next question is from Teresita, who said, thank you so much for your presentation. In religious music, such as the examples you presented associated with epidemics and patron saints of epidemics, was any of this music performed in church service settings like mass or in church devotion, or were they more so strictly performed for processions outside of church services as a public statement?
The pestilential liturgy is very, very complicated and very, very elaborate. Some of the songs would normally, especially some of these isorhythmic motets, would be used for processions, but even Litany of the Saints will form part of the processions as well. And at masses, they wouldn't necessarily form part of the mass as they don't fit specifically into any aspect of the mass. But if you take the totality of the pestilential liturgy, which normally would have started at a public center, and then the processions, and people will proceed from their various angles and neighborhoods and through the streets, and then through the public arenas, and marching eventually into the local church or the church, where eventually an anthem will be performed, a Pater Noster and Ave Maria, and then ending with a mass. Yeah, some of the songs, like other types of motets that are devoted to the Virgin Mary, such as Sela Celi Esti Pravit, would form part of the devotional aspects of the grand pestilential liturgy. But it's not clear how many of these motets would normally be performed in the actual celebration of the Mass. But we have to think about the pestilential liturgy as a grand activity that is taking place that includes so many other segments. I don't know if that, Teresita, if I've answered your question.
Yes, no, I think that absolutely answered that question. Thank you very much. Next, we're going to move into a question from Stephanie. Is there any continuing belief in South Africa that COVID is divine punishment? If so, are you seeing that represented in music right now?
There's not been any musical evidence for it, but that COVID-19 is punishment, divine punishment, is not limited to South Africa. In fact, we've seen it here, even in the United States. I remember at the very beginning of the lockdown, was one of the televangelists, the foremost televangelist who is late now, his son, started running an ad on television. Why am I forgetting his name? Not Jerry Falwell, the other big televangelist. And so there are a number of people in different circles who think that any of these form of epidemics or pandemic is God's punishment for the sin of human beings, right? We saw that even with HIV/AIDS, and it's not new. It goes back even to the Renaissance all the time, which is why there is the tendency at church quarters and churchmen to want to pray to God and even organize this thing called pestilential liturgy in order to call on the saints to intervene and the Blessed Virgin Mary to intervene. So it's there. It's not necessarily part of what we're hearing largely on radio and television and the public media, but it is there. And I've seen it both here and in Nigeria, and of course in South Africa. But no music yet have I noticed about that.
Okay, great. Thank you for your perspective there. Taking a look at the time, we're going to move into our final two questions. The next question comes from Heather, who says, what is something that surprised you about the compositions coming out of COVID-19?
Nothing really, because they just, so far, they're still, to a great extent, resembling some of the things I've already seen in other epidemics. What has not, and I say this, I know in one of my media interviews, and I say we have to probably wait a little more to see what comes out of it. There's tons and tons of songs that have already been composed. There's none that is surprising to me. Much of it is centered around mobilization, creating awareness, but a few are getting a little bit more radical, touching on some of the issues that that I have talked about that touch on economics and politics. The things I label as a social fallouts, and they're not surprising to me anyway, because I've seen that across the board as I look at music in past epidemics.
Okay, absolutely. That makes sense. Thank you for that. And our final question today comes from Sue. Could you tell us a little bit more about the specific next steps in your research?
Yeah, there's a lot I'm doing as far as my research on music and health is concerned. Like I mentioned, I'm currently arranging and exploring with another colleague who is at Loyola University of Maryland on a book project that looks at music in the global history of epidemics, so that that will try to explore as broadly as possible and drawing from different cultural areas and nations such as Asia that could be incorporated, because right now the literature tends to be limited to Europe until I started writing about what I've noticed in South Africa and then on the continent. But there's a lot coming out from that is there in other parts of the world. That's one. The other thing that I've been looking at until now, before even COVID hit, is the consumption disease and the Jewish immigrant community here in the greater Denver area, the Front Range area. For those who don't know, the state of Colorado has very interesting history with and we can see it even in some of the architecture. Many Jewish settlers who came from Eastern Europe during the early part of the 20th century came with a consumption disease, what we call consumption is tuberculosis. And this climate was considered by many healthcare providers, doctors, as conducive for managing tuberculosis. And that's part of why many Jewish people who came from Eastern Europe settled here. And what I've been trying to explore in that regard is to see the ways in which some of these may have reflected in either the popular music that was circulating within the Jewish community at the time, or even in the cantorial chants that you find in the synagogues.
Great. Well, we will look forward to learning more about your research as we move forward. Well, thank you so much to everyone for joining us for today's presentation, and a special thank you again to Austin for this great information. At this time, we invite you to provide your feedback on the webinar by answering the following poll question. On a scale from 1 to 10, how likely are you to recommend this webinar to a friend or other CU Boulder alumni? We thank you in advance for submitting your feedback. As a reminder, all webinar attendees will receive an email tomorrow with a link to the recording of this presentation as well as a survey. To view upcoming webinars as well as previous recordings, please visit our website at colorado.edu/business/alumni. We hope you'll join us for our next webinar, which is next Wednesday, June 16th, as CU Boulder alumna Meredith Bear, founder of Meredith Bear Home, the nation's largest home staging company, presents on the future of the real estate and design industries, how COVID-19 has reshaped our concept of home. In the meantime, have a great rest of your day. Thank you for your time, and go Buffs.